The morning of February 6, 1952, Philip stepped off an airplane at London Airport and understood, in the clearest way possible, what the next 50 years were going to look like. He had spent the previous few hours on a flight from Kenya, having told his wife that her father had died in the night. He had watched her face in the moment he broke the news. He had watched it change in a way he had never seen before. Now, on the tarmac, Elizabeth walked down the steps first, and Philip came after. He hung back as the official cars gathered, and then he stood there as the world arranged itself around his wife, and not him. The rest of his life had just begun, a life of walking 2 paces behind, smiling, representing, occasionally saying something catastrophic in public, and never, across 73 years of marriage, giving the press even a single sentence about how any of it actually felt. That image of a proven war hero, a man who had commanded ships and outmaneuvered German bombers and saved lives in the Mediterranean dark, reduced to a supporting role for the rest of his days, never fully credited for the things he built, never quite forgiven by the institution he sacrificed almost everything to join, is the image that Philip's public story has always circled. The gaffes get the headlines. The fruit crate crib in Corfu, the wartime exile, the lost mother, the abandoned childhood, the naval career cut short. Those get the documentaries. What gets left out is the full accounting. The man was brilliant enough to reshape the monarchy's relationship with the public through a single argument about television cameras, bitter enough about his own situation to describe himself as a bloody amoeba, and when it came to the people who genuinely disappointed him, sometimes impossible to forgive. All 3 of those things were true simultaneously. They were true because of each other. This is the story of who Philip actually was. He was born in June 1921 on the dining room table of a villa called Mon Repose in Corfu, which is the kind of biographical detail that sets the tone for everything that followed. The surgeon simply cited it was the cleanest, firmest surface available, and Princess Alice of Battenberg delivered her 5th child, an only son with no ceremony beyond what the moment required. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, was somewhere nearby. Philip came into the world in a manner that was practical, slightly undignified, and comprehensively unlike anything the formal processes of European royalty were supposed to produce. His family was royal in the specific way European royalty worked in the early 20th century, connected to virtually every throne on the continent through generations of engineered marriages, wealthy in title and lineage, and in Andrew's case, practically broke in anything approaching liquid money. Philip's mother, Alice, was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, born in 1885 at Windsor Castle, in the actual presence of the old queen herself. His father was the brother of the King of Greece, a professional soldier and a general in the Greek army. By the time Philip arrived, Greece and Turkey had been fighting, on and off, for years, with the Greek army deep inside Anatolia trying to reclaim territory it considered rightfully Greek. The Greek army lost badly. The forces retreated to the coast in disorder. The government collapsed. A military coup swept in. Several former ministers and generals were tried and shot by firing squad. Prince Andrew, Philip's father, stood before the court and appeared to be heading toward the same end. He had been in command at a moment of catastrophic military failure, and someone was going to pay for it. George V, the British king, intervened through diplomatic back-channels in the way that interconnected European royal families still could when the weight remained. Andrew's life was spared. The family had to leave Greece immediately and permanently. They were taken out on a British warship with no preparation made for an infant. The sailors, working with what was available, fashioned a cot from old fruit crates. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Philip was 18 months old. He remembered none of it and was shaped by all of it anyway. The family settled in Paris. An aunt and uncle loaned them a house in St. Cloud. Money was thin. They were dependent on relatives in the way that exiled royalty often was, technically distinguished, practically constrained. Prince Andrew, who had until recently been a general and a royal figure of some consequence, had nowhere to go and nothing to do. He was a middle-aged man without a role in a city that had no particular use for him, and the grinding of that idleness became visible slowly, and then all at once. But before that grinding became the defining fact of Philip's life, there were good years in Paris. His father adored him. His older sisters doted on him. The house ran with laughter and several languages at once, and Philip absorbed French and German as naturally as English because all of them were spoken around him. Relatives paid for a decent education. His father would wrestle with him in the sitting room, larking about, setting off what his sisters later described as great gales of laughter. These appear to have been the years Philip carried with him as something like a template for warmth, for what a father and son could be when things worked. He was watching a version of family that he would later find difficult to replicate when he had sons of his own. When Philip was 8, his mother had a crisis that the family had apparently been watching approach for some time. Alice had long had what would now be recognized as severe mental illness, though the precise diagnosis was disputed then and disputed since. She believed she communicated with the spiritual world. She would lie on the floor for extended periods, waiting for messages. The trauma of the Greek exile, the ordeal of Andrew's trial, the accumulated weight of years of displacement, all of it had taken something from her that ordinary rest could not restore. Her family decided she needed urgent professional help. One Easter holiday, the children were sent out for the day. When they returned, Alice was gone. The doctors had come while Philip and his sisters were elsewhere, put her in a car, and driven her to a sanatorium in Switzerland. She would spend years in institutions, visited occasionally, unreachable in any meaningful sense. Philip was 9 years old and had just lost his mother without warning, in the manner of someone who disappears rather than someone who leaves. His father, already adrift, gave up on family life in France not long after. Within a few years, Andrew had settled in Monte Carlo with a mistress, a tolerable arrangement for a dispossessed prince of his tastes, and a comprehensive abandonment of the son he had once swung around the sitting room in helpless laughter. Philip would see Andrew occasionally, for visits that were always cordial and always inadequate. He would not have a father in any functional sense for the rest of his childhood. He was 9 years old, with no parents. What Philip said about this, decades later, in one of the rare moments when he addressed his own history directly. "My mother was ill, my father was away, so I had to get on with it." That is not stoicism performed for an audience. That is a man who decided, before he had the vocabulary to articulate the decision, that the parts of himself requiring comfort were parts he was going to have to manage internally. He made that decision before his 10th birthday and held it for 90 more years. Decisions had to be made about where Philip would live. He was moved between relatives with real warmth and real inconsistency. Spending holidays with family in England, France, and Germany, never quite clear on where he was supposed to call home. His uncle George, the Marquess of Milford Haven, and his wife Nada took him in at Linden Manor in Berkshire. George was a Royal Navy commander, well-connected, and married in a manner that accommodated considerable extracurricular activity on both sides. The household was warm and spectacularly unconventional. The couple had what was, by contemporary reputation, the largest private collection of pornography in England. They had introduced their own son to a brothel in Paris at 17 as an educational supplement. Philip later recalled the household with something like dry affection. What he found there, more than anything, was adults who were genuinely fond of him and treated him as a real person rather than a parcel of royal obligation. After 9 years of being the latter, it was not a small thing. His second oldest sister, Theodora, grew concerned about the household's influence on her younger brother. She arranged for him to attend Salem, a progressive boarding school in Germany founded by the educationalist Kurt Hahn, who had connections to the family and a serious pedagogical reputation. Philip arrived at Salem in 1933. Adolf Hitler had consolidated power in Germany in January of that year. The Nazis had established a Hitler Youth branch at the school. Philip watched the extended arm saluting with bafflement that edged into amusement. "It reminded him," he said later, "of boys raising their hands to ask permission to use the lavatory." He was 12. He may have been too young to understand the full weight of what he was watching, though he was certainly old enough to find it absurd. His 4 older sisters and their German aristocrat husbands had by this point aligned with the Nazi Party in various degrees, which would cast a shadow over Philip's reputation for decades that his wartime record eventually had to dispel in full. After 1 year at Salem, with the political situation worsening, and Kurt Hahn himself having fled Germany as a Jewish refugee, the family brought Philip back to Britain. He went to Gordonstown. Gordonstown, near the Highlands of Scotland, was cold, physically demanding, and nothing like a conventional British public school. Cold showers before dawn, long runs in conditions most adults would have found a reasonable excuse to avoid, physical challenge, outdoor tests, the deliberate reduction of comfort as educational principle. Philip took to it completely, which surprised no one who had been paying attention to the shape of his life up to that point. He was already a boy who had been relying on himself for years. Here was a school that treated self-reliance as the whole curriculum. He thrived. He was good at sport, easy in leadership, outwardly cheerful in the manner of someone who had learned that humor was the most useful social tool. He was popular. He played practical jokes. He gave no visible indication of the losses accumulating behind him, which was exactly the effect he was working toward, even if at 12 and 13 he lacked the words to describe what he was doing. It was at Gordonstown that the next loss came. His sister Cecily, traveling to England for a family wedding with her husband, her mother-in-law, and her 2 young sons, died when their plane went down in bad weather over Belgium. Every person on board was killed. Philip was called into the headmaster's study to be told. He did not break down. He held himself in the way that had become his instinct, and he traveled to Germany for the funerals. The streets were lined with Nazi flags. Swastika banners hung from the buildings. Philip was 16 years old, walking behind his sister's coffin through a city. Under the full visual administration of the Third Reich, people who saw him in the procession described a forlorn figure in a dark coat who somehow remained composed. His grief was, as one biographer later put it, that of a man, private, controlled, visible only to the people who knew exactly what to look for. Less than a year after losing Cecily, Philip's uncle George, the Marquess of Milford Haven, the man who had given him the closest thing to a real home in his teenage years, died of bone cancer. 2 losses in under 12 months. Philip processed neither of them visibly. He kept going, because keeping going was the only response his character had learned to supply. Child psychologists would later describe, when asked about Philip's documented behavior, a classic pattern: an exterior shell built out of necessity, a surface of competence and humor that protects whatever is happening inside from examination by others. That shell served Philip well in most situations across the next 8 decades. In a few specific situations, with specific people who needed him to take it off, it caused real damage that he was never fully able to account for. Philip finished at Gordonstown in 1939 and enrolled at the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in May of that year. He was 18, very blonde, and by most contemporary descriptions of startling good looks. He had the ease of someone who had moved between different countries and social registers since childhood, who had learned to perform confidence regardless of internal state, and who fit into the Navy with the immediate comfort of a man finding his first institution that asked from him exactly what he had to give: competence, leadership, physical resilience, and no particular requirement to discuss his feelings. 4 months after he arrived, Britain declared war on Germany. Philip went to sea. Early months in the Indian Ocean escorting convoys. He was impatient for more direct action, and by 1941 he was transferred to a battleship in the Mediterranean. His ship participated in the Battle of Cape Matapan in March of that year, one of the most decisive engagements against the Italian Navy in the war. Philip's role during the night phase of the battle was the searchlights, picking out Italian cruisers in the darkness, holding them steady while British guns aimed. It required nerve and precision in conditions where precision was genuinely hard to maintain. He was 19 years old. He was mentioned in dispatches. He received the Greek War Cross. The Italians were handled so thoroughly at Matapan that they effectively withdrew. from open naval engagement for the rest of the war. Philip was one element in that outcome. He received no particular public recognition and was not the type to seek it. The incident that people who know Philip's wartime record in any detail tend to discuss with the most genuine admiration came 2 years later in July 1943. Philip was first lieutenant of HMS Wallace, a destroyer working the Sicilian waters. German bombers found the ship and attacked. The first wave passed without sinking them. Philip knew with certainty that the planes would return. He had minutes to do something, possibly less. He organized a raft, loaded it with burning flares and smoke canisters, had it pushed off the stern of the ship, then ordered Wallace into complete darkness and sailed away at speed in the opposite direction. When the German planes came back, they found the burning decoy and bombed it. Wallace escaped fully intact. Every man aboard survived. Philip's decision, improvised in under 10 minutes with nothing beyond what was on the ship and his own judgment, saved all of them. He was 22 years old. He was mentioned in dispatches. He received very few headlines. Princess Elizabeth had met Philip briefly in 1937, and then again in the summer of 1939, when the royal family visited Dartmouth, and Philip was assigned to look after the two princesses while the adults dealt with a mumps outbreak. Elizabeth was 13. Philip was 18 and paying her the kind of uncalculated attention that came naturally to him, jumping over tennis nets, suggesting she try the same, being entirely unimpressed by the royal context around him. By all accounts, she was immediately and completely smitten. She wrote him a thank you letter. He wrote back. They exchanged letters during the war, irregularly, across the years of his naval service. Elizabeth's feelings developed into something consistent and apparently unwavering. Philip's development was slower and more ambivalent. He was not short of female attention. He was also clearly intelligent enough to see what marrying the heir to the British throne would mean in practice. The permanent end of his own naval career, the permanent subordination of his own ambitions to someone else's public role, the permanent performance of a supporting part in an institution that had not yet decided what to do with him. These were not small trade-offs, and Philip was not the kind of man to ignore them. What shifted things, people who knew him during those years suggest, was a combination: the king's growing warmth toward him, the genuine admiration Philip developed for Elizabeth as a person rather than as a princess, and the straightforward fact of his own situation, which was stateless, fundless, and not overflowing with alternatives. By the time he returned from his last active service in 1946, his decision was made. To become acceptable to the palace and the government, Philip was required to make himself British. He gave up his Greek royal title. He gave up his Greek citizenship. He was baptized Anglican. Abandoning the Greek Orthodox faith he had been born into, he became Philip Mountbatten. His uncle Dicky, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had become Philip's closest mentor after George's death, managed a great deal of this process with his characteristic blend of genuine affection for his nephew and enthusiastic self-interest in seeing a Mountbatten join the royal family. Philip did what was asked without public complaint. The scale of what was being asked in nationality, religion, and name was not nothing. The king and queen were reluctant. The court was resistant. Nobody except Mountbatten was warmly enthusiastic. Elizabeth held to Philip with a firmness that apparently surprised people who had not paid attention to her. They were engaged in August 1947 and married in November at Westminster Abbey. Philip's sisters were not invited. It was too soon after the war for German family members at a British royal wedding. His mother came, wearing the gray religious habit she had taken up after finding a kind of peace through the vocation of a nun. She had, in the years since the sanatorium, converted and taken orders in Athens. His father was 5 years in the grave, having died in Monaco in 1944. There was no family from Philip's side in any recognizable sense. He had his mother in her nun's habit and a great deal of Mountbatten presence. He smiled for the photographers with the ease of a man who had been composing his exterior since childhood. He was always very good at that. The first years of the marriage had a quality of something close to ordinary happiness, which both Philip and Elizabeth appeared to have recognized as temporary and valued precisely because of it. Charles arrived in 1948, and 2 years later, Philip remained on active Navy duty, which gave him something that was his own: a career, a command, a space where his authority was real rather than ceremonial. When he was posted to Malta, Elizabeth joined him and stayed for extended visits, and the people who knew them during those months consistently describe it as the nearest either of them ever came to a normal life. She was not yet the queen. He was not yet the consort. They were a young naval officer and his wife in the Mediterranean, without the weight that came after, and the lightness of that situation was visible in both of them. In February 1952, the king died in the night at Sandringham. Philip was the one who found out first. He was the one who took Elizabeth for a walk in the grounds of the Kenyan hunting lodge, where they were staying, and told her that her father was gone. He watched her face change. Then there was the long flight home, and the landing at London Airport, and Elizabeth walking down the steps first, and Philip coming after, and the world rearranging itself with a completeness that left nothing the same. He knew, as he stood on that tarmac, what he was looking at. His naval career was over. He would never command anything again in any way that actually counted. His days of having something properly his own were finished. And then, a few months later, came the question of the family name. Philip's assumption had been that the family would take the name Mountbatten, as it was normal for a wife to take her husband's name on marriage. The children would be Mountbattens. Churchill opposed this with conviction. The palace opposed it. The Queen Mother opposed it with everything she had, which was considerable. The name remained Windsor. Philip's children were Windsors. Philip, in a moment of rage that escaped his usual containment, told a friend that he was just a bloody amoeba. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He was a man who had given up his country, his church, his career, his salary, and his right to control the direction of his own life, and who had now been told that his children would not even carry his name. He had been reduced to the genetic minimum. He had become purely decorative. He picked himself up the following morning and got on with it, because it was the only response he had ever had to anything. The early years of the reign were defined, for Philip, by a long series of battles with an institutional machine that had decided he was not quite right. He had modernizing instincts and an outsider's clarity about what the palace was doing wrong. He went through Buckingham Palace room by room, identifying what needed updating. He installed modern equipment. He pushed for better internal communication. He asked persistent questions about why things were done as they were done. The standard answer was that they had always been done that way, which was not an answer Philip found satisfying, and which he continued to probe anyway. The Queen Mother was the most formidable obstacle. She had her own ideas about how the monarchy should operate, her own gravitational hold on the court, and a deep resistance to a man she apparently regarded as not entirely appropriate for his position. Their relationship was not warm. Philip found her obstructive. She found him threatening. It was a standoff that lasted years, conducted with perfect surface civility and genuine mutual suspicion underneath. Philip won his most consequential early battle over the Coronation in June 1953. When the BBC requested permission to televise the ceremony, the palace's first instinct was refusal, and Churchill agreed, and the Queen Mother agreed. The mystique of the monarchy, the argument ran, depended on controlled distance. You did not put sacred ritual in front of a television camera. Philip disagreed, forcefully and persistently. His argument was the opposite, that the coronation was exactly the kind of event that needed to be on television, that the monarchy's connection with the public was not threatened by being seen, but was strengthened by it, and that 20 million people watching was 20 million people with a personal stake in the institution. He pushed the argument through against the Prime Minister, against the court, against the Queen Mother. More than 20 million people in Britain watched the coronation on television. The effect on public feeling toward the royal family was immediate and lasting. Philip had been right, and everyone who opposed him had been wrong. Very few accounts of his life mention this particular victory with any prominence, because the palace does not publicize internal arguments, particularly those in which a foreign-born prince with suspect family connections beats the prime minister and the queen mother on a question of institutional strategy. In 1956, Philip founded the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, built on the Gordonstown philosophy that had shaped him. Physical challenge, community service, skills development, the basic idea that young people were capable of far more than they were usually asked to give. A politician told him, at some point during the program's early development, that it sounded rather like the Hitler Youth. Philip had fought the Nazis across 6 years of active war service. He had walked behind his sister's coffin through streets hung with swastika flags. He absorbed the comparison without throwing anything and continued building the program. It eventually reached more than 1 million participants in Britain and spread to dozens of countries. He took genuine pride in it. It was one of the few things he was allowed to take any visible credit for. He championed British science and engineering across the same decades, touring factories, attending demonstrations, meeting researchers, asking specific questions about their actual work, and demonstrating on repeat visits that he had read the answers and remembered them. This was not performance. He was genuinely interested in what British engineers and scientists were doing, and he was consistent about it for 50 years, at a time when that kind of consistency from a senior royal figure had real commercial and morale effects on the industries he visited. It received very little coverage because it was not embarrassing. He was also, and this is the detail that tends to get lost in the standard accounts of him as a man of the past, an early and serious advocate for environmental protection. Philip became president of the World Wildlife Fund in 1961, before environmental concern was mainstream or fashionable or politically safe. He was giving speeches in the 1960s about species loss and habitat destruction that would not have sounded out of place in a policy debate 40 years later. The speeches were specific. He had done the reading. He was not performing environmental concern the way public figures perform it. He was genuinely alarmed, from the 1960s onward, about what human activity was doing to animal populations, and he said so with a directness that was sometimes inconvenient for the governments. His wife was nominally above. He hunted. He also understood, simultaneously and without apparent contradiction in his own mind, that the broader destruction of natural habitat was a serious problem. The hunting critics and the conservationists both had a claim on him, and he managed to irritate both camps consistently, which he probably regarded as evidence that he had the balance about right. The gaffes have to be addressed honestly, which means acknowledging that most of them were real, said without visible regret, and some of them were genuinely awful. Philip told British students in China in 1986 that if they stayed much longer, they would go slitty-eyed. He told an Indigenous Australian during a royal visit whether Australians still threw spears at each other. He told a student who mentioned he wanted to become an astronaut that he must be thick. These were said in public, in front of witnesses, with no mechanism that renders them mishearing or misquotation. What the gaffe coverage consistently missed was the man beside the gaffes, people who spent considerable time with Philip. Across decades of public engagements, describe someone with a genuine interest in the individuals he was meeting, who remembered specific details about their work from previous encounters, who went out of his way to speak with the person in the corner of the room who was not being spoken to by anyone else. The warmth was real. It was also private, which meant it almost never appeared in print. Philip had a theory, half-articulated over the years in various settings, that the managed formality of royal visits created a deadening distance between the family and the public they were supposed to be among. He thought that saying something unexpected, something human, even something that landed badly, was preferable to the alternative, which was a perfectly managed royal performance that left everyone feeling they had encountered a very expensively maintained waxwork. This is not a justification for the worst of the remarks. It is an explanation for the internal logic that kept producing them. He was also a man formed in the 1930s and 1940s, who had not updated some of his assumptions to match the world he was still living in at 80. That is a real limitation, plainly stated. But the effect of 40 years of gaffe coverage was to reduce a man of considerable achievement to a collection of one-liners, and Philip, constitutionally unable to make a case for himself, offered no resistance to that reduction. The rumors of affairs that circulated throughout his marriage were real rumors, some more credible than others. The names most frequently attached to them were women Philip had known through royal and social circles. Philip never addressed any of them publicly. Elizabeth gave no public indication of distress about them. What happened privately between them belongs to the two people who were there, and both of them, characteristically, kept it there. What is clearer is the quality of the marriage across its length. People who observed Elizabeth and Philip together in private settings describe a couple who made each other laugh, who disagreed openly, who had a relationship in which Elizabeth was genuinely fond of him rather than merely committed to the arrangement. He was the one person in her immediate world not required to defer to her, who could argue with her as an equal, who saw Elizabeth rather than the Queen. In her position, the loneliest sustained public role in the country, that was not a small thing. On their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, Philip said, in public, that the central lesson of 50 years was that tolerance was the essential ingredient of any marriage, necessary when things were good and vital when they went wrong. He said it without drama, as a man stating a fact he had tested enough times to know it held. His relationship with his children attracted more legitimate criticism than anything else in his biography, and the criticism was not wrong. Philip had grown up without parents. His model for fatherhood was his own father, who had been warm and present for a few years, and then vanished into Monte Carlo. The emotional register he had access to, the shell he had built to survive everything, was not compatible with what children need, which is demonstrative warmth, patience, and a father who can express feeling without performing it. Charles bore the heaviest cost of this incompatibility. Philip sent him to Gordonstown. Charles was genuinely unhappy there, cold, isolated, bullied, and cut off from his mother and the easier life he had known. Philip found it difficult to understand why. Gordonstown had made Philip. He could not see clearly that what had made him was not the institution, but the particular shape of a boy who had already been hardened by losses that Charles had not experienced. Philip applied the Gordonstown principle, challenge, self-reliance, get on with it, to a son who needed something entirely different. He pushed where Charles needed encouragement. He expressed impatience where Charles needed patience. The relationship between them was fractious for decades, warmer in later years, and never fully uncomplicated. Anne had a better relationship with him, partly because she had inherited something of his directness and his lack of sentimentality, and found it easier to speak to him on terms they both recognized. Edward, the youngest, had a quieter relationship with Philip, shaped partly by the long shadow of the question of why he had left the Marines so quickly after training, a decision that Philip, a man for whom military service had been the defining experience of his formation, found difficult to understand or forgive. Andrew appeared to have managed the relationship most easily in his early years, partly because the Navy career Philip had always wanted him to have. Andrew actually pursued and performed with real distinction in the Falklands War. Philip's pride in that was visible and genuine, which made the later Andrew situation all the more painful by contrast. But the Philip who had laughed in the Paris sitting room with his own father, who had been genuinely present and warm in those early years, did not fully surface in the relationships he had with his own children. The shell was too old and too well built to come off by then. The 1980s and 1990s were the worst decade span the modern British monarchy had in the 20th century. All three of the marriages of the Queen's children who had married ended in divorce or separation. The press was aggressive in a way that had not existed in earlier decades, and Philip watched it all from inside, from the position of someone who had decided 40 years earlier that the institution came first and personal feelings came a distant second. The Fergie photographs arrived at the breakfast table at Balmoral in the summer of 1992 in the morning newspapers. The images showed Sarah, Duchess of York, at a French villa with a man widely described as her financial advisor, in circumstances that left no ambiguity. Philip walked into the breakfast room, picked up the newspaper, placed it in front of Sarah at the table, and walked out of the room without speaking. There was no subsequent conversation, no attempt at reconciliation, no gradual thawing. For the rest of his life, if Fergie entered a room Philip was in, Philip left. He did not make a performance of it, he simply did it, because he had made a judgment and saw no reason to revise it. His verdicts on people who had crossed lines he cared about were more or less final, which was the shadow side of the same quality that made him reliable and consistent across everything else. With Fergie, the line was clear and his response was comprehensible. The refusal to soften it across the subsequent 20 years was something else. The thing in him that the people who loved him found hardest to reach. With Diana, Philip's approach was more humane than his reputation ever captured. He wrote her a series of letters during the years of the marriage's collapse, formal in address because that was how he wrote, but genuinely engaged in content. He tried to describe what it felt like to join the royal family as an outsider, the particular pressures of being required to become something the institution needed rather than what you were. He was not wrong to do this. He had real knowledge of that experience. He had given up his country and his church and his career to undergo exactly what he was describing. The letters did not save the marriage, and they could not, but they were a real gesture from a man to whom real gestures were expensive. When Diana died in Paris in August 1997, Philip and Elizabeth were at Balmoral with William and Harry. The palace's public response in the days that followed was handled badly by any measure. Its private response, particularly toward the two boys, was something different. Philip had unusual qualifications for what the boys needed that week. He had lost his mother at 9, not to death but to a sanatorium, which has its own particular cruelty. He had lost his father effectively at the same age. He had lost his sister violently at 16. He had stood at Cecily's funeral in Nazi Germany, a 16-year-old in a black coat in a street full of swastika banners, and he had not broken down, and he had kept going. Whatever the critics said about his emotional availability, he had a direct and unsparing experience of what loss at a young age cost, and what it required of you afterward. When the question arose of whether William and Harry should walk behind Diana's coffin in the funeral procession, the boys were resistant. Philip's counsel was direct. They should walk. He told them, in whatever words he chose, that they would regret it later if they did not. He had walked. He had done it at 16 in a foreign country under a sky full of symbols he found contemptible, and it had been the right thing, and he knew it. The boys walked. Philip had covered that ground before any of them, in every sense that mattered. The question of Philip's retirement, when it came in 2017 at the age of 95, was handled exactly as you would expect from a man who had spent 70 years doing the job without ever performing the doing of it. He attended the final Captain General's parade of the Royal Marines, which he had supported for 64 years. He walked out onto the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, stood for the salute, and went back inside. No speech, no ceremony marking the ceremony. He had finished, and he went in. The last years were spent at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, driving himself around the grounds in weather that would have given a man 30 years younger pause, reading extensively, maintaining the correspondence he had always kept up. He did not write a memoir. He gave no retrospective interviews about what it had all meant. He said nothing that could be taken as a final verdict on his life, or on the institution he had served, or on the people within it. The departure of Harry and Meghan from senior royal life in early 2020 arrived in the last year of Philip's active awareness of the news cycle, and the people around him at the time described him as saddened rather than outraged. He had written letters to Diana about exactly this. The pressure of the institution on someone who had not been formed inside it, the specific difficulty of being required to become something the palace needed rather than something you were. He had lived that pressure across 7 decades. He had not left. Whether he thought Harry should have stayed or could have been helped to stay is one of the things he kept to himself in the manner he kept everything to himself. He died on April 9, 2021, at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. The tributes that came afterward were warm and, in a number of cases, more specific than the public had heard before. The gaffe coverage had been so consistent and so loud for so many decades that the actual man had become invisible behind it, and the tributes opened a window onto someone most people had not seen. Individuals who had met Philip at public engagements described a man who remembered their names on a second meeting, who asked specific follow-up questions about work he had been briefed on and had clearly actually read, who had a genuine sense of humor, recognizably different from the awkward headline, generating clumsiness the tabloids had catalogued for decades. People who worked with his charities described a patron who was interested in what the charities were doing rather than what having his name on them did for their fundraising. Scientists and engineers described someone who showed up prepared and argued, from evident prior reading, about specific points in their research. There was a moment, described by people who were at Buckingham Palace in 2019, that captures something the official record tends to miss. A group of researchers from a medical charity were there for an audience, and Philip was scheduled to spend a few formal minutes with them before moving on. He stayed for 45 minutes. He had read their research. He had questions about methodology. He argued, politely and from evident knowledge, with one of them about a statistical point. When he eventually left, the researchers stood around in something like stunned silence before one of them said, "More or less." That was the most engaged anyone with any kind of public profile had been with their work in years. That is not the Philip who makes the headlines. That Philip was always there. The man who emerged from the tributes was recognizable as the same man who had jumped over tennis nets at Dartmouth, who had lit decoy flares off the stern of HMS Wallace, who had argued a television camera into the Coronation while Churchill and the Queen Mother stood in opposition, who had built the Duke of Edinburgh's award out of his own formed understanding of what challenge could give a young person with nowhere particularly to belong. He was recognizable, even in the tributes, as the boy from Monrepos, the boy in the fruit crate, the boy called into the headmaster's study at Gordonstown, who had found out his sister was dead and had not broken down, because breaking down was not something he was built to do. He was brilliant, and this was consistently under-acknowledged during his lifetime. He had one of the better strategic minds to operate in and around the modern British monarchy, the kind of mind that could see institutional problems clearly, precisely because he had not grown up inside the institution, and that could identify solutions the traditional machinery was too comfortable to consider. He was bitter, and the bitterness was not temperamental vanity, but earned frustration, the frustration of a man who had sacrificed everything asked of him and was handed very little credit for what he built with what was left. He was, in specific situations and with specific people who had genuinely crossed him, impossible to forgive, too controlled in his judgments, too unwilling to update them, too constitutionally certain that if a line had been crossed, the crossing was permanent. All three of those things were true. None of them alone is the story. The full story is a man born on a dining room table in Corfu, carried off a warship in a fruit crate, stripped of his country and his faith, and his career and his name, and then present at the center of British public life for 70 years without complaint, without memoir, without interview, and without ever once suggesting in any public forum that any of it had cost him a thing. The sailors built him a crib from what they had. He built himself the same way. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.